piece of paper on the wall, and this is the top line is always this, and it's how I want to approach this. Allison Jones, who's on this call, has worked with me and has seen this quote before. It's the sole purpose of education is to find worth in another man. And that's William James, and Dr. Irvin loved that, and I love that quote also. So often when I go into an archival story, I'm not an investigative journalist. I'm not trying to pass judgment on 17-year-old kids from 1908. I'm more trying to see the way history in Mercersburg has progressed to now and what we can learn from it, not necessarily trying to get into the meat of it in a different way. And often people who've been in the archive know this is how an archive works. I heard this great quote. An archive is like if you pull a rock out of the ground and you see there's a hole there, and you can't really tell what was in the hole, but you know something was there because the stories aren't written in the archive. All I can tell is that things have happened. I don't know the motivations and the reasoning that people have behind it. All you can do is kind of look at the imprint that an event had on the headmasters, on the health center, on different parts of it. So for me to start extrapolating my ideas of how to handle something right now onto how people handled it in, over 100 years ago, I think is kind of inappropriate and maybe not always accurate. And really changed the way I thought about this topic as I started to write this article. A good friend of mine, J.D. Bennett, Denise's husband, actually is a proponent of the idea is when you start looking at a story, if you have the ending already in mind, you're going to miss the story. And that's very much how this article came about. Is I almost missed what the story was about because I was so caught up in these different times that we handled epidemics throughout our history. So with that in mind, I'm going to begin kind of where this started for me. And I actually think there's some people on this call that might be able to help me. And as far as I can tell, we haven't had a major shutdown since maybe 1966. So this is all 1966 and before. But Walter, you'll know better than I if there was some shutdowns in the 70s or 80s. We had a brief quarantine of summer school with H1N1, I believe, which I haven't detailed out in this. This is really major shutdowns at the school. So the first one I found was in 1908, and that was for Scarlet Fever. And this is something that really came in to clarity for me. Scarlet Fever was a known commodity in society. It had been around for decades before 1908, and it hit Mercersburg Academy. It was so bad, some years they had a 25% mortality rate. It's basically a really bad sore throat is what it is, which closes up, causes other infections, shut down some organs. And it seems to me, and you can kind of trace this, when the disease was known, the school had an immediate reaction. Because in 1908, we had 2 cases and school shut down instantly. It was people, and I don't know if that was because parents demanded the kids to go home because they knew it was also very dangerous for kids. It had a higher mortality rate in children than it did in adults. So when this happened, the school was shut down. But what's fascinating about this is the day it happened, it just spread like wildfire through the campus. So-and-so has scarlet fever. So a group of kids, a large group of kids got together and they hastily packed their bags, packed their trunks, and were ready to leave. Dr. Irvin wouldn't allow them to leave campus at this point because they felt like they had it under control. They had the kids sequestered, and but the kids took matters into their own hands. So at this point in 1908, they decided to get taxis, which would have had to have been buggies. There were actually cars of some sort at that time. As a total side note, there's this film from 1906 called A Walk Down Market Street in San Francisco that I watched for this, which shows what traffic was like in 1906. It's fascinating. So that's the same situation these guys had in 1908. So they ordered buggies and taxis, and they're trying to get to Greencastle to get off campus. This is how quickly, it spread. This is the same day. And they weren't able to secure taxis. So they just hoofed it. They walked 11 miles to Greencastle, a group of about 30 kids. And Dr. Irvin caught wind of this when the kids were gone, and they hiked there. And when they arrived in Greencastle, they definitely had taxis for the trip home. So he called ahead to Greencastle and had taxis lined up waiting for the kids at the train station who had to come all the way back. So the kids came back, but even at that point, he probably realized, and folks probably realized, this is a serious and scary event. And they canceled school for 2 weeks leading up until spring break. Most of these, by the way, seem to take place in the spring. Not all of them, but a lot of these seem to take place in the spring. And a lot of they did the cancellations of school that lumped right in with spring break. So that was the first outbreak, and the first time I found kids actually leaving school. So the second time was in 1918, and it was also scarlet fever. So we got 10 years separating this, and this is in the spring of 1918. So this 17-18 year, the scarlet fever hit the campus again, and this time they didn't even play around with it at all. They actually took a 3-week break, and they took it immediately, and it led into spring break. So that cleared up. Now we know what happened in 1918, and this was really one of the meat of my research, was to see how the school handled the Spanish flu, which isn't even the Spanish flu. Do you know the only reason they call it the Spanish flu is because in World War I, Spain was neutral, and their press was free, and they were the first ones that were able to broadcast at a large scale that there was an influenza epidemic going on. They actually called it the French flu. The Spanish thought it came from France, but it ended up becoming the moniker the Spanish flu, but it almost certainly didn't originate in Spain. So the Spanish flu hit campus, and it hit right at the beginning of the year. It was like mid-September. We had one football game, undefeated year. We beat Baltimore Polytech 35-0. They canceled football. Now, what I find amazing about this is the reaction to it. The Spanish flu swept through campus. We had over 200 kids in the infirmary. They actually turned the gym in Nolde, like the old gym, the wrestling room or workout room, that gym, into a makeshift infirmary. They had the senators clean out the bottom basement floor of the Nevin house or the pest house. And they actually, some of the senators were acting as nurses to the sick students. But we didn't cancel school. And in fact, throughout much of this, we took, this is when things got a little unusual, is we took in the news, we would put things like this. I'm going to share this. This is this is the Surgeon General's guidelines that were printed in the 1918 news on how to handle infectious diseases. And I've got to be able to pull this up. And it's right here. And hopefully this works. So what's amazing about these guidelines that were printed is that many of them are very, very similar today. You know, avoid needless crowding, smother your coughs and sneezes, cover your mouth and nose. You know, so some of them I don't think have quite bared out. You know, one of my favorites is avoid tight clothes, tight shoes, tight gloves, seek to make nature your ally and not your prisoner. So we posted these in the 1918 Mercersburg News, but on that very same page, they printed an article that had this. And here we go. So the name of this is Stay in the Groove. And there's a second part to this too that I can post. And I don't want to read it all to you, but it is an editorial in the newspaper on the very same page where the Surgeon General's guidelines on how to handle this is posted. And in this is talking about how how you have to stay in the groove of the school, that this epidemic that's sweeping the country seems to have affected fellows who just want to sit back wondering what will be done. It details about how school is not going to be dismissed as the way it's going, and that you just need to sort of it really showed very low compassion. In fact, right at the bottom here, it says, No one knows, but it is certainly the height of imbecility, although naturally to a certain class of weak need. And then I'll put the other part on here. Seems like I should have a better way to do this, but I don't. Weak-kneed individuals, always to sit back and do nothing but lazily wait for things to happen. You know, at this point, you know, I started to think, well, this is an unusual little commentary, particularly one to post without an author into the news. So it makes me wonder who actually posted that. You know, maybe the heads of the news or whoever did it. You know, on the exact same page is actually almost a counterbalance to the Surgeon General. There's an interesting sort of give and take here. And another story from that era that I found in a letter that was written from a senator. By the way, for those of you who don't know what senators are, they are a group of individuals that were basically the CRC and the student government combined at the same time. They phased out, I think, in the late 50s, early 60s, and they were at times even handled disciplinary matters, small disciplinary matters, or anything that had to be done around the school. They're school leaders. They were voted in by a group of peers and a group of administration. So I found a letter from one of the senators back home talking about how they're talking about how they had to clean out the health center, how they had to become nurses, how they carried people from dorms to the health center. And then another, and this shows you what different type of time it was. The senators said that they found a group of kids had been sneaking out and going downtown under quarantine, and that they took the students to the train tracks and corrected the behavior. And they guaranteed the administration that we wouldn't be worrying about those students any longer in terms of their behavior. So they were judge, jury, and executioner during that situation. And at that time, and this is really kind of key, I found this poem, which I think is kind of fascinating and sort of illustrates, I think, maybe better than those commentaries, what was going on at the time. Also, this poem was written anonymously by Simon. There were no Simons in the school. And this is out of the October 12th, 1918 news. The Spanish flu is near our school, therefore we must obey the rule. The football stops upon the fields, the students start between meals. True to the town, we go no more, but stay ourselves above the floor. Plows and staggers well go broke from lack of money, school folk. Our dear old talk room well be quiet from the daily boyish riot. Nor must the boys pass up the hour, standing neath the scalding showers. We keep ourselves upon the hill, and every hour take one small pill. And all these rules will keep in sway to keep the Spanish flu away. Now, I might be reading into that a little more because I was sort of at this point thinking that the students were taking this a bit tongue-in-cheeky. And I have to impress that at this time, we were just ending our 4th year of World War I. These students were raised in a time where there was about 40 million people died in World War I, and they were in the 4th year of it. They come from a different era. Maybe something like the flu wasn't scary to them. And this was the very beginning of the flu. Little did they know, the Spanish flu conservatively killed more people than World War I did. So conservatively, the Spanish flu killed more than 40 million people. Upwards of 100 million people is the variance you get, and the total is there. So after that, the next step, and this is what really was the meat of my article, was in 1931. 1931, we had a polio epidemic on campus. Now, sorry, polio outbreak, not an epidemic. 2 people came down with polio, and polio, like scarlet fever, was something that the school knew and generations before knew all too well. There was an outbreak, I forget it was sometime in the mid to late 1800s till the vaccine for polio came out. There was active outbreaks at some place in America every single year. So This was the first outbreak we had at Mercersburg. And what's amazing about this is, I mean, these two students, both of these students died on campus. And that wasn't the first time a student had died on campus, and it wasn't the last. It was the first time I know that a student got sick with a disease and actually died in the health center. Here is a brief little snippet. I can't find both students. I think one maybe was not in the news, but this was printed, and there's a nice write-up about the funeral itself in the newspaper. I would imagine in today's world, I can't imagine that school would not shut down with two students dying of any disease, particularly one as contagious as polio. But the school actually took a different angle to this, which is amazing to me, and I'm not certain I know the reasonings behind it. But what they did is, the students were, again, it was a serious scare. They brought in groups. They shared this letter right here with the community. And this is from Boyd Edwards in 1931. And it is, nope, that's not it. There we go. It is a letter explaining out the various things the school did to make the school safer than going home. That is sort of the angle they took. If you look at it, they brought in an expert from the Pennsylvania State Health Board, specialist from Johns Hopkins, doctor from the United States Public Health Service, was residing in the infirmary as a volunteer scientific observer. And as you go through it and you get a little further down, they pledge absolute care of the boys. They're going to take care of the boys, and they want the boys to stay on campus. Now, if you look, what he also offered, what Boyd Edwards offered, and I'm going to go ahead and unshare this. I don't want you just reading an article here. But they said, if you want to go home, anyone can go home that wants to go home. And as that letter was written, 158 students had actually left. The number ended up being right around 200 students left campus. And this is in 1931. This is also during the absolute beginning of the peak of the Great Depression. And I'm certain that students stayed behind for various reasons. It could have been transportation reasons, too far from home. Maybe their families felt that they were safer with, doctors from Johns Hopkins in the health center. Maybe that was a safer option than going home. But those students who stayed went on for it was just over 2 weeks that went on. And then when the new students came back, Boyd Edwards held a community gathering. And this is what first really kind of piqued my interest. And I think I actually was thinking about it wrongly when I was thinking about it. He wrote a speech, and he praised the students who stayed behind. And it was the very first thing that happened when everyone got back on campus. And in this speech, he called it "Bravely Faces Them Still," from the alma mater, obviously. And there's a much longer detail, but in the face of great crisis, fear, and struggle, men cleave to one another in a great understanding, a great fellowship, which bring forth the finest courage of the heart. When an event happens in a country that reveals such a power, history records the time, and man makes it a great tradition in the mental, moral, and physical growth of that nation. As it goes further down, it says here, at commencement, there's going to be a silver square, marks the Christ of this history. And he made a point to produce this silver lapel pin that is a square because of four square sidedness of the strength of these boys to stand up to polio. And on it is a Mercersburg M that says bravely, and inscripted on that is "Bravely Faces Them Still." And that is the whole reason I was going to write this article. That was going to be the artifact in the magazine. And I was going to write just the story of those who bravely faced polio. And then I got further into it. Then I became part of the COVID-19 response team. And my thoughts of that started to change. Now, what I did is I sent out a request, because I went to the archive and I could not find that pen. I've never seen that pen, but I sent a request with the help of Jason to every one of the kids that fathers would have been here in 1931, 32, and 33. And lo and behold, Ron Smith found one. His father, David Smith, class of 32. He just said, you know, I sort of remember seeing something about this. I'm going to go find my dad's old jewelry box and dig through it. And sure enough, he found a pen, which I hope comes to the archive sometime. If anyone in this call happens to have one of these, I'll gladly take it off your hands. But there's a lapel pin that bravely faces them still. And I think that is really honorable. And I think that Boyd Edwards is trying to do a good thing, but I find it odd to actually honor, to in any way make someone feel like they're in a lesser situation by fearing the disease, you know. And in today's world, it's the absolute response we're taking. So it started to switch in a way of do I honor this? Do I think this is appropriate? I think it is. And I think it's an amazing story. I think there might be multiple reasons why the students were prompted to stay on campus. Like I said, it's the depression. The school was really struggling. This was one of our darkest periods. I'm sure you didn't want to send a lot of boys home, fear they wouldn't come back, and in that type of situation. But I think it's neat that, you know, we actually found the pen and we can write the article on it. Going forward, there's only been a few more times that I can find where we've actually closed down. I don't know if anyone's ever noticed, while they're sitting in the auditorium watching the Irvin Marshall contest, that every year is listed except 1936. In 1936, there's a blank year. And that year we had a flu outbreak. And that year, something like 240 kids came down with the flu, and they had to cancel the entire month. And they canceled the Irvin Marshall debate and sent them home. And, you know, really the only other story that I find that's fascinating, and I think this is interesting because I don't know what year this was, and I can't actually find record of this. It was during Dr. Hizra's reign, which was he was one of the doctors on campus from the mid-30s to, I believe, right around 60, maybe late 50s. But a case of the German measles broke out on campus. And the German measles is not life-threatening for the most part, particularly in kids. It's usually they just get a bad rash and they get some swelling. They might get an earache. It's very contagious. So they automatically quarantined the kids. But the problem was these kids were two of the leading roles in the Stony Batter play. And the Stony Batter play is Volpone, which is like Volpone, which is a 16th century British play comedy. And these two students had two of the lead speaking parts. And they made them continue to study their lines while in quarantine. And as the play was going on, they got the kids out of bed, took them up on stage, and they actually made them wear masks that they took makeup and drew their faces over. And they had to perform the play while wearing masks with like their faces drawn on top of it. But outside of that, that took place in 43, we had a huge fever outbreak in 46 that was managed. And then in 1966, where we had someone that was going to be on this call, but he backed out, there was a big food poisoning that hit almost 100 kids right at Christmas. And they canceled Christmas 6 days early. And, you know, in terms of the article, and what I'm trying to say is sort of my confliction is what I decided to do when I read that poem and I read sort of the reactions to it is I decided to get with Michelle Pacelli, who's the head of the Writing Center here, and see if we had any students that had written poems on the current pandemic and epidemic. And sure enough, we did. And when I read this poem, it really kind of solidified the difference. So the first one I read to you was from 1918. And, you know, it was talking about not being able to go downtown to the grocery store and, you know, not being able to hang out with friends in the common room. And the second one by Saskia Minter goes like this. It's entitled Red Thief. It says, uh-oh, what is this? Is there something on the bottom of the screen, guys? Oh no, hold on, we're done. Sorry, guys, hold on. All right, the poem's entitled Red Thief, and I'm just going to read it off of here because it's actually blocked on mine. It says, Red Thief, you, do not don gloves or a mask. Whoever heard of a thief whose victims wear gloves and masks? You, lurk in the shadows, threatening to break and enter at any given moment, but no one knows what's stolen until they go looking for it and find that everything is wrong. You are unashamed of yourself, wrapping your fingers around their throats, their chests, their bodies, choking until red-rimmed eyes glaze with distance presence and die. I mean, the first poem is it's said tongue-in-cheek, and the other one said with a lump in your throat, and that's how I feel about this. I feel that at one time, yeah, we bravely faced it still, and I think we are in the way we handle it today, bravely facing what we can. I can tell you on the committee I work, we're exploring everything, we're doing everything we can to be safe, but it's a different time. And I think what I want to impart, and what I'm going to try and impart in the article, is that each administration, I hope, did what they could at their time with their information, with their knowledge, with their expertise, to keep everyone as safe as possible. I think one of the differences today is the students. In 1918, they're telling people to stay in the groove. In 2020, we're fearing for our lives. And I think that's an interesting dichotomy of the generations. So that's my article. I don't know, if that made a lot of sense or if that was good, but I'd like to open it up to some comments or questions if anybody has any.
Doug, I don't know if you saw, but Adam put something in the chat about having faith in institutions, and maybe Adam, you can, I think you were kind of talking about what Doug was ending up with, but how that might change, but it still kind of shows faith in leadership and institution at the time. Is that what you were trying to refer to in that comment?
Yeah, I think I know Coach Smith was talking about how it's weird that they were rewarded with a pin, the square, right? And for staying on campus. But I think it takes the courage it takes is to really trust the leaders at a school to have their well-being on their mind, right? And I think that's something that's important even today for people like me, right? I think compared to what compared to my college, I think I have more faith in what Mercersburg is doing. I think having that faith makes all the difference when we're in a time of uncertainty. And I think that's what the leaders were rewarding, because they believe in the students believe in the leaders, and in the same way that our schools believe in us to do good things. So that's how I thought,
That's fantastic, Adam, and I think you're right. It's and I feel, maybe I'm wrong on this. I feel like there used to be more of a faith in authority and a faith in maybe even intelligence. Like, these people actually have our best interests and do know a little more than I do about this. Whereas today we're so inundated with so much information, anybody can be a partial expert on something, and it seems like then, I think you're right. Yeah, they're rewarding the faith. I'm actually going to steal that from you, Adam. So I'll give you a little bit of credit there.
So if I can ask a question, I'd first like to say thank you, Mr. Smith. I really enjoyed this. And also, I hope everybody else who's on the call is doing well. and these nice Mercersburg alumni connections are really wonderful. So I wanted to ask you one or two questions, Mr. Smith.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to know if the school had any kind of explicit response to the so-called Asiatic flu outbreak in 1957 and 1958, and also when HIV became really a prominent talking point in the public several decades ago, and whether the school had a public position or had to change any of its activities as a result. And then the other question I had was that at one time when you and I were having a conversation, I think you mentioned something to me about sort of a tradition that the Mercersburg boys had of sort of having funerals for students who died on campus early in the days of Mercersburg. And I was wondering if you could say anything about that. Thank you.
Yep. All right, Eli. Yeah, thanks. I do remember that conversation, and I think I just read in one of the Mercersburg history books about there's a tale of a student who died. I'm going to mess up the year, but it was in the aughts. It was in the early 1900s, and when they told the story, they told it as if it had happened before. Now, I don't have a record of that happening, but they had lined the back of Main Hall down to the health center, the student body lined as they carried the student out. This particular student had died in the dorm and carried them out and down. I think that's a story I told you. I wouldn't say that's necessarily a tradition, but that is a story that I have heard before. In terms of the Asiatic swine, yeah, that was one of the smaller outbreaks. We did have a certain number of students. There was no cancellation of school for the swine flu in the 50s. And the HIV, and maybe I can I call on Walter to answer that? We have our head of school on this call from that time period. I don't know anything about that. If we had, I'm sure there's education that went on, but I don't have any formal answer to that. Walter, do you have any thoughts?
There was nothing.
There was nothing. Yeah.
Not to be proud of. There was nothing.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure there's general sex education that went on in the school, but I doubt there was in terms of any type of contraction. I've never heard of anything along those lines.
Doug, can you hear me? This is Tim Rockwell.
Tim, how are you?
Yeah.
Yep.
I think what happens, like polio, I lived through an age in which I pushed a kid from a colleague, friend, for 2 years in a wheelchair in high school. It had gotten polio. And then we had a number of other people that got polio. But I think the attitudes changed when we got vaccines. Now the attitude toward it was different. You had to truck it out. There was no cure that people knew. Nothing could prevent you from getting it. And of course, FDR was a great example of that for the people. And yet you kind of trucked it out. That was the whole attitude. And as far as the flu in the 1957-60 thing, I happened to be on a Navy base at that time, 40,000 men. We got quarantined, bang, just like that. Nobody in, nobody out. You had to have a temperature of 102 just to go to sick bay, 104 to get in the hospital. And they give you a blanket and a handful of what they called APCs, all-purpose capsules, and go back to the barracks and truck it out. That was the whole attitude. And that changed eventually when we began to get vaccines for flu. People say, I have friends, you get your flu shot. Well, no, yeah, whatever. There are other people who are going to get their shots. And so I think the attitude changed back to the Silver Square time. You went home, so what?
Yeah.
You went home, so what? It didn't make a difference. And so some people stay, but I agree with you too. You don't know what the full impact of the depression had been at that time. And but anyhow, I thought your comments very interesting. I found that the whole attitude toward this and what's happening with the government right now, it just fascinates me, but it scares the hell out of me at times.
Yeah, it does me too, and I think it does our student. I think that was the part as I went through it. Like do want to champion that square and that bravely faces them still. And I think you're right. And that's much of our history you have to look at. And Tim, you know this as well as anybody. You have to look at it in that time frame. When you put our current, and we have more knowledge, we have more understanding on how to not transmit diseases. When you put that onto what was going on then, that's a dangerous game to play. They said in the brief article that I posted in the letter they sent home, that the PA health official that was staying on campus estimated that 95% of students had immunity to polio already on campus. So there's a herd immunity on campus to begin with. So contracting it would have been a much lower risk. That was kind of the angle the school took toward it, you know.
Yeah.
So can you put up that kind of death announcement that you kind of shared earlier on real quick? There was something in there that I thought was very indicative maybe of the times, and maybe I misread something, but.
Just the one that had the announcement, Jason? Is that what you're saying? Yeah, hold on. This is part of a larger article. It just I didn't get scanned.
Yeah, I mean, it was like, honors young manliness. I think that, that saying, kind of what you were talking about, that was the manly thing to do, was to stay on campus, what an interesting, I mean, at least that's the way that I'm reading it, kind of an interesting perspective, I think, on it, and very different than I think what we would see today. It sounds so weird to try to picture that, people being manly, or a Mercersburg man fights the flu by staying on campus. I think that's an interesting perspective to see it written that way.
Yeah, and that type of verbiage, and for those who've read stuff on Dr. Irvin, I mean, he was very much into sort of the Christian manly way. I mean, that was absolutely in all the rhetoric of all of our old information. And I think Tim is right. I think they had also been dealing with that disease for so long, and there was examples of it that it might have. I loved what Adam said about you're rewarding the faith in us that we can take care of you, but part of me does feel that this was about do the tough thing and stick it out, and that's why I have a little bit of uncomfortableness about championing it as much as I am actually championing it. What was this in the chat here? Yeah, Margaret, I already had that included. I have the full thing included in it. Don't wear tight clothes. That could be a problem with today too. We just need to promote that with our students right now.
Coach, what about the opposite? Because I know you've been thinking about like what it means to leave campus and go home. Mm-hmm. But I think for like Eli, I think Brian was on here. Like for a lot of us, like in college right now, it's kind of happening. What happening is the opposite. It's like, what about kids who can't go home? What about kids who do not have a place to be? So I think a lot of times when I think back to high school, it's about not only about a physical like location, right, but it's also about family and community. And I think a lot of that is missing in college because people come and go, and that's especially a problem for international kids. And I know from what I've seen international kids at Mercersburg right now in their classmates' homes before they can go anywhere else. So I think that's something like you can talk about. That's what we're doing, is very much about providing a community and a home even at times like this. And I think that's why, like Jason knows, I've been on these calls for a few of them now, but it's just one of those connections. I feel like this is the best 4 years of my life. It's not college. If my college kick people out when times get tough because they don't want to have liability and they don't help us find places to stay, then I don't know. I think what Mercersburg has been doing has been amazing, and it's something I'm proud of that I can compare to. with my college experience.
That's awesome to hear, buddy. I hadn't really thought of it in that way. Maybe some of these students didn't have somewhere to go. I don't know. You know, the student that gave me the pin, he said that his father and their family were a working class family in outside of Cleveland somewhere, and that they probably didn't have the money to go home. So there might be some truth to this was their home. This is what they felt they needed to be at. Yeah, those are great counterpoints, Adam. You know, yeah.
Mr. Smith, this is Kristen Vickery. This is
Hey,
great.
Kristen.
I'm super interested in this. As you know, my great-grandfather was in the administration of the school during the Spanish flu and some of the other things. And I'm wondering about sort of the impact on information and communications. You know, right now we're getting all of our information on COVID-19 in real time. We know what's happening in China and in Europe and in South America in real time, and the school can assess the risks as they're happening. But, you know, 20, 50, 80 years ago, that kind of information just wasn't available. You would get the New York Times one day at a time, 24 hours later, and that's where you got most of your information. What kind of impact do you think that had on the school's response to epidemics?
Yeah, I have looked at it, Kristen, more as that had an effect on the students, like something like the Spanish flu. And this is what it seemed to me is polio, scarlet fever are known commodities in society for decades leading up to it. They'd all been aware of that fear. When this new influenza came, they really didn't understand it, and they wouldn't have an ability to get that information, like you said. So that's how I viewed it, not necessarily from the administrative response. I can tell you that the administration was quickly responding with state and national level healthcare providers. At the time, we had Dr. Boone was a major part of the school and was leading most of our health causes. He was the head of the board and physician to the White House and a major player. So I feel like I do, like Adam was saying, feel like the administration was informed very well, much ahead of the students. And I see the information gap being with more of the common person. I think now that information gap, like I was saying, is you can get too much information where you can't decipher what's real and not real at this point in time. And I feel it, but you know, the scare still happened across campus. So the students obviously were aware, you know, except with the Spanish flu, which I think is an interesting comp to right now. You know, I haven't quite been able to finish the article and tie it all together the way I want, but it seems like there's some sort of comparable, because it's a new disease that is hitting and is fast hitting, and the information then would have certainly not been able to be at the fingertips as it is today. And I think it's amazing to see the responses in the poem that we got from our student today and the poem from our student in 1918. It's just a matter of sort of, before I judge too harshly on what we did in the past, also, I want it all to be sort of holistic and understand that we're dealing with the information we had in each period of time, you know. So I don't know if that answers your question, Kristen, but.
Doug, could I cut in here again?
Please.
Can you hear me?
Absolutely, Tim. I can't see you, but I can hear you.
Pardon?
I can hear you. I can hear you, bud.
I was just going to say the other thing. I think that I like your approach to this is that for kids, well, everybody's a kid to me anymore. The students, death is remote here at the Burke. As dean, and of course Walter and I both had two students, one die on campus, one killed in an auto accident. But other times we get information, most times for a lot of kids, it was usually a grandfather or something like that they had to confront with it. And sometimes we get them home, or they're at a distance, they couldn't even get out of school, they're that far away and all that type of thing. But it always struck me that I guess so. I think all of us probably growing up were like that. That you were carefree. The world was in front of you. All of this, and unless you see death like they used to see it a lot more. People don't die like they used to die. He died in a home, you know. And I can remember carrying an uncle out in a rubber sheet when the mortician came. And so death was different in those days too. And
so Tim, are you saying you feel that death was more prevalent in the student's life then than it is today? Is that what you're saying?
well, in some ways it was real, and yet it wasn't. I mean, it's always remoteness. When does death occur? And you're like, if you're not at home and your grandfather dies, and he probably lived next door or down the street or something like that, small town America, and you just, depending on where you were, how you saw it. And of course, the war, World War I, had a great impact, I think, on people's concept and the young people's concept of death. You just experienced it, see the people that came back from the war, and look what it did to Dr. Irvin, trying to go through all these letters and things and the deaths that were pouring in, his boys.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny, I've seen a couple of questions about communication, and I think about this year, you know, it feels like we've been in this forever, but things happen pretty quickly. When the students left for spring break at the time, you know, they left, and then it was when it was in China, and so we required some of our international students to stay on campus. We didn't think they'd be able to come back. You know, that they'd have to quarantine coming back, and so we had about 20 students on campus over spring break. And just during that spring break period is when it hit the United States, and then we couldn't bring students back. And so, you know, kind of the way that we were able to kind of pivot kind of quickly and take another week and then move to virtual learning is pretty unbelievable. And I can't imagine how we would have been able to logistically do it without internet and with, you know, so to think about, you know, probably just jokingly, someone says, was it a telegram? But that, you know, that's what Doug and I were talking earlier, like, you know, Mom, I need to go home, stop, you know, and like, well, they'll get this in about a week, and then we'll figure out how I can get home.
The telegrams were a legitimate thing. You know, I have telegrams from Dr. Irvin to people that are just like that, like sit and stop, ... You know, Western, then a telegram back. I would have to guess it was mail, right? That's how, I mean, telephones.
Yeah. Maybe.
Yeah.
I think the big question, it's kind of frightening for me, is where do we go from here? I mean, if we get another outbreak at the end of the summer, we get flu in in the fall, where are we? And again, are you going to be able, it was wonderful in some respects that you had the spring break thing. A lot of people were home on breaks and stuff like that. I know in the college that helped too, but we may not have that in the fall. And I think some people are starting already to think about pushing back, dropping a whole full semester or a couple terms at the college level. It's tough.
It's keeping us awake at night, Tim. But
that sure would. But the other thing to think about, back in we were talking about the Depression a while ago, the other thing when Dr. Edwards was facing all that same stuff, you know, he refused to fire anyone, to let anybody go, but he said, hey, we're all taking 10% across the board, including me. Staff are only going to work, be 3 weeks of work and 1 week off. And everybody kept their jobs, but everybody took a lick, and that was because of the Depression. And I sit around and I'm no longer with the school, but I think about it a great deal. I mean, you know, food contracts, how are you going to feed people in this situation? Your staff coming and going, day students in and out, people passing through, everything enters my mind. We don't have xenophobic people living in this community. I'm sorry, I'm born and raised here, but we have that kind of thing, and I'm afraid that some of it's going to rear its ugly head.
I want to stay mindful of people's time. You know, one thing that I've enjoyed about these conversations that Doug and I had going into this is that, you know, Mercersburg has been through these before. You know, this isn't our first rodeo, so to speak, and obviously everything's a little bit different. But I remember early on in early March, and I was talking with Katie Titus, and I said, "Oh, Katie, I'm so sorry that you have to go through this." And Katie said, it's going to be unbelievable what we're going to learn through this, what we're going to learn about what virtual engagement looks like, what virtual teaching looks like, you know, what we'll learn. And at the time, I thought that she was just the forever optimist. But now that we've done these things, and I think about what our graduation looked like, I think about the opportunities that this has brought about for engagement. I think about Jim Stockdale's session and an opportunity for him to share his story and for people all over the world to be able to hear it. I think about some of the class happy hours that I've been on when we've had people from Australia and people from Alaska and people connecting in ways that we haven't been able to do this. And one thing that we say is that when we do go back, you know, we're not going to go back to where we were. You know, things are going to be different in a lot of ways, including opportunities for virtual engagement and virtual lessons and virtual teaching and being able to really think differently. And so I know that Mercersburg is going to come out in a different place, but really we're learning a lot through this process. And, you know, thank you all for coming in tonight and learning with us. And Doug, thanks again for sharing this with us. You know, I do want to point out that tomorrow night we're having a session that's going to be with Dean Hosgood, who's class of '98, and Rachel Porter, who's class of '09. And they're both public health experts, and they're going to be able to kind of speak about the public health implications of COVID-19, and you know, a great opportunity. I encourage people to register for that session as well. We're also moving soon to virtual reunion, which is going to have some great sessions online, and I encourage you guys to check out our website at mercersburg.edu/events and see future events that are going to be offered. But we're going to continue to offer opportunities like this for people to connect and learn and think differently. So thank you again for joining us tonight. I'll send Doug's email in my follow-up. I know with a lot of these sessions, questions happen at night or something that you think about afterwards. So feel free to reach out to him afterwards, and we hope to see you at another event soon. So thank you very much, Doug, and thanks to everyone for joining us tonight.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Appreciate it.
Yep.